Hello, and here we are in the bush, and we're in the bush because today we're going to be talking about a very particular Australian genre of writing, which is the Australian Gothic. Now, we're down in the bush because the bush plays a very, very particular role in the Australian Gothic genre. Unlike the Gothic in its English or American variants, the Australian Gothic has zero supernatural qualities to it. The Australian Gothic is all about what happens when white fellas go out into the bush. And, well, we'll talk about that. So, firstly, what's an example of an Australian Gothic novel? Well, Kenneth Cook's Wake in Fright is an Australian Gothic. It's not in the bush because it's out in Broken Hill and it's out in the outback, which is a different. There is the bush and there is the outback. The outback is further west. The outback is well away from civilization. Civilization being the capital cities. Australian society resides in the capital cities and along the fringe of the coastline very heavily. So that is where the majority of the population live. The majority of the population of Australia, all 25 million of us, live within an hour of the coast. So I, being quite a lot further out from that, I live in the bush. I don't live in the outback. The outback is past the farms. Okay? You're starting to get it? Just because it's bush doesn't mean it's the outback. This is the bush. But the bush and the outback are two things that are very important when it comes to the Australian Gothic. Kenneth Cook's Wake in Fright, where John Grant, the school teacher, is out in the bush, out in the outback, right out in what is in that book called the Yabba, or further out than the Yabba. The Yabba is representing Broken Hill, the big city, what everyone calls the city, out there. And John Grant is a Sydney school teacher. He's doing his mandatory several years, which is what you did back then. You did a mandatory several years out in the hard-to-staff schools, and he's a single school teacher in a one-teacher school out in the middle of nowhere. Whoop Whoop. You ever heard of Whoop Whoop? Well, he's out in Whoop Whoop. He's in Whoop Whoop. And so he has a Gothic experience. Other Gothic novels that you may have experienced or may have heard of include In the Winter Dark by Tim Winton, which takes place on a rural property in Western Australia, though the rural property of Western Australia is transferable to rural property anywhere in Australia. In fact, the film, which has Richard Roxburgh in it and Miranda Otto, and if you can find the film, well worth watching, was filmed down in the Megalong Valley in the Blue Mountains and a little bit out in Oberon. But mostly it was filmed in the Megalong Valley, and the quality of the surrounding cliffs and these little farms down in the valley is just so powerful. You can't, it has that trapped quality to it. Another book you have definitely heard of, or at least you've heard of the film, is Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. The book and the film are both Gothic, the one with the girls in the white dresses who disappear with the panpipes. It was part of the revival of Australian film in the 70s. Very famous film, Gothic novel. And another one that I can think of is called The Well by Elizabeth Joly, which is probably the least well known of these three. I don't think it's been filmed. Probably could be. It would make a good film. But these all have the characteristics of Australian Gothic. Now, English Gothic is a very particular genre, and it generally has a certain degree of supernatural. So something like Dracula is a Gothic novel. American Gothic definitely has supernatural. It often is located very geographically, the deep south or the really old colonies like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and all that sort of side of things. Australian Gothic can occur anywhere in this country. It is not geographically determined, though it's not urban. Basically, once you're out of an urban environment, you can have an Australian Gothic. Australian Gothic has the quality of the bush is terrifying, not because there is something in the bush. That's the really important thing. There is nothing in the bush. Nothing is actually terrorising the people in a Gothic novel in Australia. In overseas novels, in the English and American variety, you can often have a thing terrorising. But in the Australian Gothic, it is people encountering a landscape. These are people who are terrified by a landscape. These are people who encounter a landscape and an isolation that they can't cope with. So an Australian Gothic, so John Grant out in the Yabba discovers a world where consequences are pretty elastic, a world where you can play two up and win enough money to buy out your contract or lose all your holiday pay. A place where you can live on a 3-day bender because everybody comes along and says, here, have a beer, my shout, my shout, my shout. A place where you end up so filthy and humiliated and degraded that you no longer recognize yourself, and a place where you see that other people's lack of inhibition, and you see the monster you too could become out there when nobody has where you don't have the consequences of civilization. So that is a very particular form of Australian Gothic. Another form of Australian Gothic, which you see in The Well and you see in the Winter Dark, is people who live in an isolated community and then a new element comes in. In The Well, it's a burglar, and in the Winter Dark, it's the people's fear that a big cat, the story of the big cats, the story that during the war that the Americans brought over big cats as mascots for their flight crews and then let them loose in the Australian bush, or that they had escaped from circuses, this fear that there's this big cats out in the bush. There are a lot of feral cats out in the bush, but this is a particular urban legend, the Black Panther out in the bush. And in that book, they are afraid that this thing is going to come and get them. They're isolated. They can't get out easily. And they turn on each other, and the tension builds. Nothing is out there. Nothing is out there. It's not that it might be. It is actually a case that nothing is out there, but they manage to level themselves up, gear themselves up to such a level of hysteria that terrible things happen. In The Well, the well is used to control the old woman's young companion, to control her, to hold her, this idea that there is a body in the well, that she has convinced this girl that it is, and that she is the only one who can protect her because she hit her with the car. It's probably a ruse, but she doesn't know that, and the tension escalates and escalates and escalates. So Australian Gothic is a really particular Australian genre. It is about, it's very, very psychological. It's about a fear of the unknown, a fear of what is out there. And it infuses Australian writing. You can do an Australian Gothic in an urban setting. The Glass Canoe by David Ireland, which I will talk about with Wake in Fright in a little while, is actually an Australian Gothic in an urban setting in Sydney, and it's dark. It has some unbelievably dark humour, and it really pulls you in and sucks you in about into this world that is very. It's not just amoral. It's really quite immoral. I mean, the sociology student gets welded into the beer keg. I don't think I'm spoiling this for anyone. Everyone does work this out, but that's the sort of edge that Australian Gothic can manage. It is about that dark side and facing that dark side, and the fact that the dark side keeps coming out when you least expect it, and in places where you are alone with yourself. Not everybody disintegrates in the Australian bush, but that isolation, that great Australian loneliness, is at times a catalyst for enormous psychological breakdown, which forms the basis of the Australian Gothic. And it makes it unique among Gothic literature. It also makes it the only genre that we have invented in our own country. This is our version of Gothic, as deeply, deeply unsettling. So I will leave you here and see you again, because I think there are ants crawling up my leg. So I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.